Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Afghanistan continues to stay in the news for all the wrong reasons. While efforts towards finding an elusive peace continue, there's more on why U.S. government officials have a disincentive to tell the truth about the situation in Afghanistan. John Sopko, the blunt-spoken Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, says, and I quote, "We have created an incentive to almost require people to lie," unquote. He was speaking at a hearing of the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Wednesday. His comments came in response to a question about Afghanistan papers published by the U.S. newspaper, The Washington Post. There is an odor of mendacity throughout the Afghanistan issue, Sopko said. Mendacity and hubris. Very strong words indeed, and an indictment of 3 presidents and their administrations. Meanwhile, on Thursday, the Taliban gave the U.S. envoy, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, their offer for a temporary ceasefire in Afghanistan. The ceasefire, according to Taliban officials, would last between 7 and 10 days. Let's open the discussion for tonight with our panel. We are joined by Ambassador Mathew Bryza, joins us from Istanbul, and Mariam, Wardak, the journalist, anchor for South Asia Diary, and joins us from Kabul. Thank you to both panelists. Let me begin with Ambassador Bryza here. Ambassador Bryza, this is not news, frankly. Sagar has been reporting lots of these shortcomings in previous years also. But these are very strong words, mendacity and hubris. Is there a structural problem here in terms of the incentive that he's talking about for lying and dissembling about what happens in Afghanistan or what has been happening over the last 18, 19 years?
Yeah, based on my experience, especially serving on the National Security Council staff in the White House, I think he's absolutely right. To provide an anecdote, I remember one time back in around 2004, I was in the White House, and this pertained to Iraq. But I said to my boss, you know, boss, it doesn't seem like the Iraqi people who are being subject to these militia attacks and being tortured, the Shias who are really under attack by Sunnis, that they really care about these democratic principles we think we're trying to build in Iraq. What they care about is establishing basic security so they can live to see the next day. And I was chastised, and my boss said, oh, you're not talking like a member of the team. But I said, but this is the truth. So I think that's what we see in the case of Afghanistan. The U.S. has invested such an enormous amount of blood and treasure that our effort in Afghanistan has become too big to fail. There's giant moral hazard here. Moral hazard, A, to the careers of the people involved, if they're seen to be failing, and moral hazard to the country overall. I mean, it would be, you know, another war lost. So, yeah, there is this disincentive to telling the truth. There's a desire also, I think, in a, if I can say, strategic sense, to make sure on the part of these bureaucrats that the United States doesn't simply pack up and leave Afghanistan, because they honestly believe that could be a disaster for all parties concerned.
This is very ironic, if you agree with me, because having been in the U.S. myself, I was at Brookings, I saw some very smart people talking policy, academics, people who bring theory to practice and take the practice back to theory, all of that. But it does seem that the 1972 book, The Best and the Brightest, which you recall was about Vietnam, and that syndrome seems to stay. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. Again, you know, once big bureaucracies get vested in a particular policy direction, the natural tendency is to continue in a spirit of inertia. And I think what happens is, like in Vietnam, we start to get negative information that doesn't correspond with either the plan or the aspiration, and that information is discounted, whereas the positive information is embraced. And in the case of what we're learning now from Afghanistan, it's even worse. It's that the United States government was manipulating the sort of information it was gathering, both in terms of the types of surveys it was conducting and in interpreting or misinterpreting the results. So that is a big structural defect of American foreign policy.
So one of the things that we about, so there are structures, of course, but then there are processes also, learning curves, so to speak. Now, in businesses, private businesses especially, what we see is you go into a venture, you put in money there, you realize after some time that it's not working. So instead of sinking more money, you cut your losses and you get out. But it seems that governments, and it's not specific to the US government, it's most governments in the world, that they do exactly the opposite. So that is a problem. And it seems to me that, if we go by organization theory, that, there is bounded rationality and there's also systematic stupidity.
Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful way to articulate what I'm trying to say. For somebody who's a career government official, the benefit you get, the incentive, is not usually more money. I mean, you get your pay raises on a sort of an annual schedule, keeps up with inflation. If you get a promotion, then a few times in your career, you're on a new pay scale. So your incentive is to build an empire as you move up through the bureaucracy. Your incentive is to attract as much money to your programs, the ones that you control, as possible, because that's how you get attention and that's how you get prestige in your career. And so the incentive system is to spend as much as possible and make sure you spend it by the end of the fiscal year, because if you haven't used up all your budget yet, you will not get as much money in the next fiscal year. So the incentive structure is completely not based on the profit motive and is the opposite of the corporate world.
Because there's another side to this picture also. It's not just the US. And for that, let me go to Mariam here. Mariam, so the United States, of course, made several mistakes. There have been a number of analyses, papers, books about what happened in Afghanistan and also in Iraq. But there is another set of actors, and that are essentially the Afghan political and other players in this. And I recall meeting Abdullah in Washington for a conference in 2012. And on the sidelines of the conference, I was speaking with him, and he was quite candid about the fact that he said, well, the Americans have made mistakes, but we as Afghans have also not been able to reach out to our own people. So give me a sense of what was it that the Afghan post-invasion elite could have done but failed to do?
I want to brush a little bit on what Ambassador said. There is something that we shouldn't forget, that when the Patriot Act happened, many of the Americans who decided to come into Afghanistan decided to turn a blind eye to everything that was happening. It was all based on emotion. As President Bush had jumped on people's emotions and wanted to take some sort of a revenge when he said, we will not falter, we will not fail, we will not waver. And unfortunately, all three seem to be taking place. Now, on the Afghan side, you have to reflect on what's been happening in Afghanistan. For the past 40 plus years, they've been in a state of war. So these people don't really know how to build nations. It's pretty much how to fight. So we know how to defend and we know how to fight, but we don't know how to build institutions. We don't know how to build roads. We don't know how to build nations. We don't know how to come together, united as one, because we had a really long, and we are still in a continued state of a civil war because it's an Afghan fighting another Afghan. Now, what is the problem? The problem here, again, unfortunately, it does lie on the United States side, that the United States should have built some sort of bridges amongst the different ethnicities and the groups that were in Afghanistan, which included the Taliban, and then bring them to a united front. Unfortunately, it seemed like every Afghan took a side of a certain foreign counterpart because it seemed like the Northern Alliance was closer to the French, and it seemed that other groups were closer to the United States, and so forth and so forth. So it was the Afghans' fault, but in some parts, I don't really blame the Afghans because they didn't know much more than how to just defend and fight. Now, the Afghans who returned from abroad, they because there was many of the people who were in leadership who had come from abroad. And I think over here, Ambassador Khalilzad had really a large responsibility. President Karzai had a responsibility. You had Minister of Defense, Minister of Interior, all of these people who came from abroad. Why didn't they come and teach others how to be more united? Was it because it was a quick call for patriotism and they just wanted to do something really quickly? And when you're working in Afghanistan, you see the results very rapidly, which in one way is great, and another way not so much, because it also feeds people's ego, because you think that you make much more of an impact. So it's an unfortunate situation, and it's really great to hear that Abdullah has mentioned that it is the Afghan soul in its continued state. So now, 18 years later, where we have had education and we've had experience, why isn't it that we're not learning from it? Why is it that we have all, including the Americans, including other our foreign partners and the Afghans themselves, why are we not looking back at history and reflecting on what are we doing wrong in trying to change the course?
So Mariam, I'm happy. I'm sorry for this interjection, but since you talked about history, and I think that's a great point. So, as an Afghan, you know one thing. If you look at Afghanistan's history, what you see is that it's essentially Kabul negotiating with the rest of Afghanistan. So you've got the QOM, the Solidarity Group, and you've got the representative of that QOM who negotiates with Kabul and generally with the external world. And so every time you take that route, there is some kind of compromise, some kind of modus vivendi, and things move on. But every time you see these sort of downers in Afghanistan history are when Kabul, and this is regardless of who ruled Kabul, tried to take central control or impose central policies, whether it was King Zaire, whether it was Dawood, whether it was PDPA, whether it was the Soviets, and now this particular episode since 2001. Now, since you talk about history, shouldn't the Afghans have sat the Americans down and said to them, look, this is how our history has worked, and this is how we would like you to proceed? But to me, that did not happen.
Right. No, there were certain actors, there were certain village actors who had communicated this to the government officials and who had communicated to certain people in the U.S. government and in the military. But at that time, you have to understand, right now, diplomacy takes the front seat in Afghanistan. But that's been only happening after the Obama administration. But before that, it was just a military front that was going forward, because it was all fighting until we had entered Iraq. So there were certain individuals who had stood up and said, this is the wrong way to step. We do approach everything in the provinces through a tribal mechanism. We believe in talking. We can't just go raid houses. We can't just go to use military force. But nobody listened. And those who objected were then also, unfortunately, punished for speaking out and trying to say something. So then when one was punished, others just stayed quiet, because again, these people have seen so much in the past 40 plus years that they just didn't want any more war. And they was like, okay, fine, the West, the foreigners are here. They want to think that they can rule Afghanistan, so let them do it. Well, which is one of the things that worked in the benefits of the Taliban, and why the Taliban have continued to grow within the public, because their narrative is the same. And what do they say to everybody? That we have the time. You may have the machinery, you may have a large number of people, but we have the time, and we're going to continue to win the public. So what happened with the elders in the provinces when they realized that the foreign forces were not listening to them, their own forces were not listening to them, they started giving space to the Taliban, because it was the Taliban that were listening to them say, yes, you're right. See, we told you that this is a foreign invasion, that they're going to try to rule us in their own mechanisms, and they're trying to eliminate how we act. So it's an unfortunate situation. And I do believe there were actors, and they were just punished for speaking out.
Okay. Ambassador Bryza, on the structural problems, do you think it is correct to say that perhaps the situation in Afghanistan would have taken a positive turn if the United States had not decided to open another war front in Iraq?
Yeah, I very much do feel that way. Again, going back to my experiences inside the White House and from 2001 till 2005, I remember the kind of euphoric sense throughout the transatlantic community that was there, that we were all working together. that we had defeated together, I mean, with our NATO allies in the coalition, the Taliban. And now we had a chance to do just what Mariam was talking about, rebuild this place, rebuild Afghanistan with a positive vision for the future. And we may recall that the same Ambassador Khalilzad convened the conference in Bonn, right, to try to create a new inclusive political system. I think that attempt was a little bit sort of ill-advised in as much as our vision in Washington was we're going to create a democratic system, yeah, with some centralization in Kabul, even though there would be recognition of all the tribal differences. But that was probably a bridge too far. Nonetheless, that was ongoing. There was an attempt to be wiser this time. And then everybody did get absolutely diverted by the Iraq War. The oxygen got sucked out of the room. I mean, in terms of strategic thinking, I remember there was planning to shift then our assistance, not just military operations, but our economic assistance away from Afghanistan and toward Iraq. And I remember being somewhat terrified by those discussions because it was obvious that, oh my gosh, we were laying the foundation for Afghanistan once again to go up in flames.
Now, this is very interesting because we were at the White House at that time. And, you know, it seems to me, so I was there September 2002 through May 2003 at Brookings. And I saw firsthand, a kind of ringside view of what was happening. And I recall Ivo Dalda, who later became the U.S. ambassador to NATO, who was at Brookings at that time, was opposed to it. Jim Steinberg was in favor of it, so was Ambassador Martin Indyk, and Ken Pollock, of course, was essentially going on a book tour promoting his book, which actually said that the U.S. should invade Iraq. And then there were these Israelis who would come to the Saban Center, and I remember they used to have these working dinners, and they would essentially say it seemed like they were desperately pushing the U.S. into Iraq. Now, I just want to get a sense of what was happening at the White House because there was another war already going on in Afghanistan. What was the sense there in terms of the discussions? From what you have said, it seems to me that you were obviously opposed to it. But at the end of the day, the U.S. did go into Iraq. And that is where the problem began. That in and of itself would not have taken care of the structural issues in Afghanistan, but perhaps the U.S. could have poured in more resources and perhaps conducted the, whatever it wanted to do, constitution, parliament, this, that, and the other, with a greater degree of thought.
So there are a number of theories on whether or not George W. Bush when he took office, whether he was planning to invade Iraq. A lot of people say he wanted to complete the unfinished work of his father and go further than his father. Others believe that then Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld always wanted to do the same thing, get into Iraq. I don't subscribe to that.
Neither do I.
You may remember at the beginning of the Bush administration, second Bush administration, Secretary Powell was really vocal about how the United States needs to get out of the business of nation building and by extension, nation breaking. But what I did observe was that there was some sort of a intellectual transition that happened in the wake of the U.S. military success in Afghanistan, where definitely some senior officials at the Pentagon, I mean, Secretary Rumsfeld, Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz, wanted to pivot away from Afghanistan, but for a somewhat thought through strategic reason. Their idea was that, okay, we just defeated this one safe harbor for Al-Qaeda that just struck us on September 11th. Where's the next place where something terrible could happen? What's the worst thing that could happen in the most volatile region in the Middle East? And the idea was that, well, a Middle Eastern country that is developing weapons of mass destruction might share them with terrorist groups.
Yeah, but Ambassador Bryza, here's the thing. One, it's a misconception. I mean, and the U.S. military obviously realized that in the sense that how exactly do you define victory? I mean, conventionally speaking, the U.S. is the most powerful military in the world. But what comes after the initial, uprooting of the adversary is something totally different. And secondly, the idea of the Iraqi WMD, even at that time, people knew this, it was discussed, that was a hoax. So there was something else at work. I want to get your quick thoughts before I wrap up this segment.
In my experience, well, first of all, yeah, I think what happened was, in terms of the pivot from Afghanistan to Iraq, the top decision makers in the U.S. decided, okay, the major military operation is finished in Afghanistan. Let's leave the rebuilding to the developmental people, State Department. Oh, but let's shift some of those assets to Iraq, and then let's defeat Saddam, and we'll be successful. Naive. We did not plan the post-military operation situation in Iraq as much as Afghanistan, even though that's been a failure. On WMD, I have to say, my view is a little bit different from conventional wisdom. I believe Saddam had them at one point, destroyed them because he was afraid, and I am certain that my superiors around the White House or the State Department sincerely believed that the weapons had existed and wanted to know where they were now. Now, the curveball stuff, of course, the U.S. was duped on that and the mobile vans that Secretary Powell showed at the UN Security Council. But I can say in the planning, just put it this way, in the planning of the U.S. military operation in Iraq, there were dates when the U.S. troops were supposed to have to don their protective gear. It was actually predicted that the chemical weapons were at this spot. When the U.S. troops go past there, they will then potentially be under attack. So people believed it. They were just wrong about the fact that whether Saddam actually still possessed those weapons.
Yeah, well, we'll have that discussion bilaterally at some point, but thank you so much. As always, Ambassador Mathew Bryza was speaking with us about the situation in Afghanistan. Mariam, a very quick response to how do you see the road ahead? I mean, mistakes have been made. Are we trying to sort of now rectify them, or are we making them once again?
I really don't know what's happening, because when I reflect on what the U.S. policy is and then I look at the Afghan policy, I'm so confused. They're so different. I think that if we are going to start engaging with the Taliban, and it seems that we are, then the Afghan people also need to be ready for it. This is just not an engagement for the world with the Taliban. This is an engagement with the Afghan people and the Afghan Taliban. And that's going to take a process, because within Afghanistan and the Afghan people, many of them believe that the Afghan Taliban are the enemy, and the Afghan Taliban brought us to a certain state. They somehow have a memory span of 2.5 seconds and have forgotten what happened with the Soviet invasion and the Mujahideen. So therefore, it's the responsibility of the Afghan government and the Afghan leaders to sit down and actually inform.
Well, right now, I totally agree with you, but right now we are not even sure who to continue as the president. The results are still to come. Whether there's going to be a runoff, if there's a runoff, it's not going to happen until April. So there is a lot of uncertainty on that front also. But thank you so much. That was Mariam Wardak speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to continue with our discussion of Afghanistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We continue with our discussion of Afghanistan, and in this segment, we're going to talk about the ceasefire offer that the Taliban officials say they've given to Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, and this came out on Thursday. We are now joined by Hamdullah, who's a political analyst, joins us from Kabul, and Rahimullah Yousufzai, who is the resident editor of the news and joins us from Peshawar. Mr. Hamdard, how do you look at this? 7 to 10 days of ceasefire. Is this some kind of feeler? These days are to test this and then perhaps to go forward with ceasefire?
I believe that Taliban showed this flexibility just to make sure the U.S. signs the deal with them. However, this cannot be called a ceasefire. They have agreed to reduce the violence, and they have agreed with the U.S. Not to attack on the major cities and on the highways. I guess this will not be enough for the peace process. However, it might be enough for motivating or for convincing the U.S. to sign the preliminary peace deal with them, in which they have their specific conditions. but for the sustainable peace and durable peace, and whenever Taliban starts negotiation with the Afghan government, I guess such reduction of violence will not be enough, and it will not suffice for the Afghan people. They might have, or they may have to go for the ceasefire with the Afghan government when they start the stage of the peace negotiation with the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan.
Okay. Mr. Yousufzai, how do you look at this situation? Are there any concerns here? Is this, obviously it's a positive development, but do you think it will go further?
I think it's a very significant development. Imagine nothing was happening until now. The fighting was continued while the talks were also taking place. So to stop violence even for one day, I think is really important. And it shows the intention, I believe, that, if there are serious talks, if there is a give and take, then ceasefire can also happen. It's not the first time that Taliban are observing a ceasefire. There was a 3-day ceasefire earlier during the Eid al-Fitr holidays. But I think this is now a longer ceasefire, and it is as a result of the peace talks. Yes, I agree that there is a need for a longer ceasefire as well. And there has to be a ceasefire also between the Afghan government and the Taliban. But that will take time because until now they are not talking to each other. So, I think that, the original American demand was a permanent ceasefire. Taliban were not agreeing.
You were saying that as far as operations against the Afghan security forces are concerned, the Taliban will continue with those operations, but they will not attack non-military targets. They're not going to attack the U.S. forces. Is that correct?
I think a few things about the ceasefire are not very, very clear yet, because the term being used is reduction in violence.
Correct.
So we have to see, whether this will extend to the whole country or also to the Afghan government. But I think there will be definitely a ceasefire between the US-led foreign forces and Taliban. This will create the right conditions to sign the peace accord. I think that is the purpose of this ceasefire. One American demand has been partially accepted. Taliban demand for the withdrawal of foreign forces will now have to be accepted. But I think it's a long way to go until we have durable peace, and that will only happen when the Afghans talk to the Afghans. I mean, Taliban talk to all the anti-Taliban forces.
Yeah, that's going to also there's uncertainty there. Now, Mr. Hamdard, if there is a ceasefire, 7 to 10 day ceasefire, in terms of the Taliban saying that we're not going to attack the US forces, we're not going to attack the non-military targets, but they continue to attack the Afghan national security forces, then how is that going to, because Kabul has constantly been complaining that the US is trying to get a peace deal with the Taliban while cutting Kabul out. If this happens in this scenario, that allegation would seem to become, it kind of adds to the veracity of that Kabul is being cut out.
As you know, Taliban are saying that they have been fighting against the foreign troops or against the NATO troops or American troops in Afghanistan during the jihad. So when they stop fighting against the Americans in Afghanistan and they continue fighting against the Afghan national security forces who are completely Muslims, and they all know that, then here Taliban will lose the trust of the people and the support of the people that they still have in the areas where they have dominated. They will have a big loss here, a big loss of the trust of the people, a big loss of the support of the people if they continue fighting against the Afghan national security forces and stop fighting against the American and NATO forces in Afghanistan. So this 10 days ceasefire or reduction in violence against the US forces is not in the benefit of Taliban. However, I pointed out before that Taliban will have again, they will gain the peace deal, or they will continue to sign the peace deal with the US and will get their trust only for a short time to gain this peace deal. However, they will lose the trust of the people, that those people who
that's a
believe in Taliban,
that's a very important that's a very important point, Mr. Hamdard. Let me take this to Mr. Yousufzai. Mr. Yousufzai, Mr. Hamdard's argument is that the Taliban have been fighting against what they said occupation forces. And they were also fighting the Afghan National Security Forces because the Afghan National Security Forces were considered to have been trained by and were part of that force, that occupation force. Now, if the Taliban are going to make a deal, a ceasefire deal with the US and NATO forces, but continue to fight the Afghan National Security Forces, then according to Mr. Hamdard's argument, they will lose the trust of the people. Do you agree?
You know, since January 2015, when the bulk of the NATO forces withdrew from Afghanistan, there were not many foreign forces who were a target of Taliban. And the ones who were still there, they were confined to their bases. They were mostly using air power. And that's why the Taliban were launching more attacks against the Afghan security forces and killing more Afghans. As President Ashraf Ghani conceded, 45,000 Afghan soldiers were killed in the last 5 years of his rule. So basically, this fight was then now between Afghans, Taliban versus the Afghan security forces. And the foreigners actually were not getting targeted, in most cases. That situation will remain. I think the withdrawal will also take some time. And until that time, I think Taliban would like to keep up the pressure. They would like to put pressure on the Afghan government, Afghan security forces, because they will be observing a ceasefire with the foreign forces.
So you are basically saying that they're not going to, they don't think that they will lose the trust of the people if they continue to put pressure on the Afghan National Security Forces.
No, I think, if they target Afghans, if more Afghans, are targeted and they are killed and injured, I think that will be a loss for Taliban. Although they have their very steadfast supporters who don't care, but I think if they want to win the support of the common people, common Afghans, they will have to realize that, they cannot always target the Afghan forces.
So you are agreeing with Mr. Hamdard's point here?
I am partly agreeing with him because, as I said, for the last, say, 4 or 5 years, they have been basically fighting the Afghan forces and not the foreign forces.
Okay, let me go back to Mr. Hamdard. Mr. Yousufzai's argument is that they've been, the Taliban have been fighting against the Afghan National Security Forces, which they consider as an adversary. But they'll probably not attack non-military targets, not attack Afghan civilians so that they can retain their support base, but at the same time keep putting pressure on the government in Kabul until such time that a process begins and perhaps something positive comes out of that.
See, I'm living here in Afghanistan, and I know why people trust in Taliban, why they believe in their fight. Taliban's argument is that they fight against the Afghan National Security Forces because the Afghan National Security Forces are standing in front of the American and NATO forces, and they are defending the international forces in Afghanistan. Correct. So once the Taliban have signed a deal, or once they announce the ceasefire with the international troops, then they have no reason, then they have no justification for the common people to fight against the Afghan National Security Forces. If they do, remember my words. I also say to Yousufzai, remember my words, the Taliban will lose the complete trust and support of the people in Afghanistan. Then they will have no justification why they are still fighting against the Afghan National Security Forces. Because for the moment, till the moment, their only justification is that they fight against the Afghan National Security Forces because the Afghan National Security Forces are defending the international security forces and they are guarding the international security forces. once they sign the peace deal with the international security forces, so no justification and no proper reason for Taliban to fight against the Muslim Afghan national security forces in Afghanistan. They have to announce the ceasefire. That might be the final thing they could go for. And if they do not announce the ceasefire or do not go for the ceasefire with the Afghan national security forces or the Afghan government, and to go for the peace negotiation with the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, under which the political parties, the civil societies, and everything comes, these two will have to start the intra-Afghan peace negotiations and will have to go for the ceasefire if they continue the ceasefire with the international security forces in Afghanistan.
Very interesting. Mr. Yousufzai, what would you say to this argument?
Yes, this is one of the reasons that the Afghan security forces were allied with the foreign forces, and they were fighting and protecting the foreigners, and that is one of the arguments, but there are also other arguments. These are two different sets of people. They have been fighting each other for so long. Remember when Taliban emerged in 1994-95, they were fighting the same Afghans, who were opposed to them. They were fighting the Afghan government even at that time, and they managed to occupy almost 90% of the country. So there were no real, foreign forces at that time. So the foreign forces came in 2001, but before that, Taliban were fighting the rival Afghans. So that's why I'm saying that they have to reconcile with each other. They represent two sets of ideologies, two sets of opinions, and they have to talk, negotiate, and reconcile. And if they continue fighting, I think there will be hardcore elements on both sides who will then support their side. Yes, Taliban, will lose the trust of many Afghans who want peace and reconciliation, but there will also be many Afghans who have been supporting the Taliban, and they will continue to support the Taliban because, they have their children fighting on the side of Taliban.
That seems like a civil war scenario once again.
I will not call it a civil war, I think. Maybe the Afghans are now more mature. They want to resolve their disputes through negotiations, not through fighting. There is now this, democratic process in Afghanistan, bringing a change through elections, peaceful, transition.
Yeah, there is uncertainty there also. There's uncertainty there also, charges of fraud and corruption and the rest of it. And of course, if there's going to be a runoff, then the entire thing is thrown forward, at least until April, given the weather in Afghanistan. But thank you so much for your insights, Mr. Rahimullah Yousufzai. Thank you also to Mr. Hamdullah, Hamdard. This is all for this week from Indus Special. We shall see you next week at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.